Most of our cherished memories and family traditions revolve around meals. I mean, there's something about gathering family and friends together around food that shapes a community, a group, a people in a powerful way. And this explains the centrality of feasts all throughout the Old Testament. I mean, you see the Feast of Pentecost and you see the Feast of Passover. All of these communal gatherings mark significant events in the history and life of a community. And these communal gatherings passed down through the generations connects the past, the present, and the future in a way that grounds and orients our identity to the world. Esther is centered around 6 feasts that mark out significant moments in the narrative of the entire story. The first 3 feasts, 2 by King Ahasuerus and the 3rd by Queen Vashti, establish the reality of Israel's exile under foreign powers and sets up the rise of Esther. And Esther and Mordecai in the beginning are these powerless characters. They're kind of tossed to and fro by the whims of the powers that be. But when Esther rises to power, she institutes 2 feasts for Haman and the king. And there's a reversal. Now she's exercising her agency. Now the balance of power is shifting to her. And here in Esther chapters 9 and 10, we encounter the final feast, Purim, which commemorates the deliverance of the Jews from destruction through Esther's brave action. And this feast ensures that future generations, when they partake of this meal, remember the faithfulness of God. That the same God who delivered his people in the past always lives to care for his people in the present, and he will secure their future. This is Understanding Esther. At the second banquet, Esther finally reveals her identity and petitions the king to spare her life and her people from annihilation. Knowing the king responds only to his own self-interest, she shrewdly frames her plea in terms of his interests. He might lose his queen. He might lose his throne. So she exposes Haman as the enemy who's vying for the throne and vying for the king's queen. And that leads the king's fear and anger to turn against his most trusted advisor, which leads to Haman's execution on the very gallows that he set up for Mordecai. But Esther's task is not finished, because the decree by Haman through the king against the Jews can't be revoked. So she and Mordecai have to issue a counter decree allowing the Jews to defend themselves. And this counter decree is paralleling the original decree in every way to show that the state is behind Esther and her people. And this leads to the decisive victory we're going to see in chapter 9. Chapter 9 breaks down into 3 sections. First, the Jews triumph over their enemies in verses 1 to 10. Second, Esther asks for one more day for the Jews to defend themselves in verses 11 to 19. And finally, the Feast of Purim is established, verses 20 to 32. Let's look at that first section where the Jews triumph over their enemies. On the 13th day of Adar, which is the day set for their destruction, the Jews reverse their fate and gain the upper hand over their enemies who attack them. So there's this decree of self-defense. They can strike down those who attack them, and they're also allowed to plunder them. And this leads to this fear of the Jews and of Mordecai, who has now ascended to the heights of power. And all the provinces are getting in line with this new order. In Susa, the capital city, the Jews kill 500 men, including Haman's 10 sons. And this is going to lead to the next section when Esther actually requests another day of defense. A couple things to note here. This depiction of the Jews defending their lives against attackers brings resolution to the overarching problem facing both Esther and Mordecai, the irrevocable decree of Haman. So their counter decree is not a revelation of their bloodthirst, but rather it's a political maneuver to ensure that the people of Persia understand which side the royal court takes in this conflict. So the Jews receive permission not to attack other groups, but rather to defend themselves against destruction. And the text notes multiple times how the Jews did not take any plunder. So even though they had the permission to, there's this restraint that they demonstrate. They're not out to steal from others. Rather, they're simply acting in self-defense. Also, if you note that the 10 sons of Haman were killed, Haman is an Agagite. He's from the Amalekites. Agag was the Amalekite king. And if you look back to 1 Samuel 15, God commanded Saul from the tribe of Benjamin, which is the ancestor of Mordecai, God commanded him to kill Agag, the king, and not to plunder him. And of course, Saul does the complete opposite. He lets Agag live and he plunders the Amalekites. But here in Esther, they don't plunder and they do end Haman's line. So there might be a reversal here where they're being faithful where Saul was being unfaithful. But you can see that their fortunes are reversed. In Esther and Mordecai, they rise to power and they have governmental power to help them act on behalf of their people and to overturn this unjust decree. God intended government power to act as an agent of justice, to be a mechanism by which to protect people. And so Mordecai ascends to that place of power, similar to Joseph, and he uses that power in order to deliver his people, much like Joseph did generations before. And yet, despite this massive victory, Esther makes a stunning request. Give the Jews one more day to defend themselves and publicly hang the sons of Haman after they've been killed. Why does she do this? Well, we're going to look at verses 11 to 19 when Esther makes a request for one more day for the Jews to defend themselves. Okay, now she's not just out for blood or bloodthirsty again. We have to think politically. And I think Rabbi Foreman, again, who's I'm drawing a lot of information from. He wrote a book called The Queen You Thought You Knew about the book of Esther. And he helps us think about this for a moment by considering a hypothetical. What if Esther hadn't requested another day? Okay, imagine that the king calls for the Jews to put away their weapons after one day, and then the political messaging that the state stands behind Esther and her people is going to fall flat. And also there's going to be escalation, right? If you have just killed all these people one day, you're going to expect the next day, if you're not allowed to defend yourself, there's going to be retaliation. So Esther has this small window to send a lasting message. She has to make a public spectacle of Haman's dead sons to show we mean business and that this alliance between Persia and Esther and her people is here to stay. Rabbi Foreman writes this: in acting as she does, Esther puts the final touches on a grand deception. She has made it seem as if the palace is unwavering in its support of the Jews. No one knows that. In fact, all the Jews have is but one more day. No one knows that at the stroke of midnight, all their royal carriages will turn back into humble pumpkins. You can look at the king. He really doesn't care. He's all about himself. So he's not really caring about whether the Jews are going to be perpetually safe. Esther knows that she has to work the system herself. So she fights a war of appearances. She knows that this requires a political response. A political injustice requires her working through those mechanisms to say, hey, we are under the protection of the reigning powers that be. So don't mess with us. She's trying to secure the safety of her people. And this leads to the establishment of the Feast of Purim. Now, throughout the empire, we see that 75,000 enemies are destroyed. And Mordecai records these events and establishes the Feast of Purim as an annual commemoration of sorrow turning into joy. And so the Jews in the king's provinces gain victory on the 13th day of Adar and rest with feasting and gladness the following day. But the Jews in the capital city of Susa gathered on the 13th and 14th day and rested the 15th with feasting and gladness. So they're trying to issue a decree to make a standardized celebration. They say celebrate the Feast of Purim on both days. And this is going to be a perpetual reminder of how God delivered his people. And then there's this more specific explanation. The feast is called Purim because Haman cast Pur, which was I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly in Hebrew, but P-U-R, Pur. He cast those, that's the word for lots. The very instrument that Haman cast, seemingly putting things to chance on the day that he would exterminate the Jews, that very instrument becomes the name of their celebration of their deliverance. So it's highlighting the reversal of fortune. Things aren't up to fate or the roll of a die, but rather it is up to the providence of God. God is behind all things. But there's a deeper level to this, and we've mentioned this before. In this final chapter, it not only says that it is named Purim because of the lots, but also because of Esther's action, that she brought the decree that reversed Haman's decree based off of his casting of lots. What does Esther have to do with lots? Why is she also included in why this is named Purim? Well, remember in chapter 4, Mordecai tells Esther that if she remains silent, deliverance for the Jews will come from elsewhere, but she and her father's house will perish. Why does he make this about her and her father's house? Well, Rabbi Foreman connects this to Numbers 30, where there's a law about annulling a wife's rash vow. If a wife makes a rash vow, her husband can annul it within 24 hours. Otherwise, if he remains silent, the vow goes on. Esther must speak. She cannot remain silent in order that she might annul the king's deadly decree, or else her silence will seal her fate. She will be complicit in the destruction of her people, even though God will eventually deliver them. So it's a question of whether she's willing to be courageous and be part of God's redemptive story or work against it. Now, Alistair Roberts connects Numbers 30, which is that law about annulling a rash vow, to Purim by noticing the ironic reversal, right? Esther annuls those lots by refusing to remain silent. So whatever the lots do, she has actually reversed that. And again, Rabbi Foreman writes this: it turns out the word the book of Numbers uses for annulling the declaration of one's spouse just happens to derive from the word pur, that is from the three-letter root Pei, Vav, Resh, the three Hebrew letters. Pur, the word which in ancient Persian or Aramaic means lots, just happens in biblical Hebrew to mean annul. So in the context of Esther, that term pur, not just about Haman's lots, as Rabbi Foreman is noting, but it also refers to the act that Mordecai told Esther to do, to annul. So it's not just about the pur of the lots, but the pur of her annulment. And this becomes a reminder for all generations about the faithfulness of God. It's not fate that determines the destiny of his people. It is his providence, and that's what Purim celebrates. Now here at the very end, we have Esther 10, this short little conclusion. The king imposes a tax on his empire. Mordecai's greatness gets recorded in the royal chronicles of Persia. He goes down as second in command to the king, who sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. So this happily ever after ending expands beyond the story of Esther to this larger narrative of the Old Testament. Note that Mordecai gets remembered as a great Jew who speaks peace to his people. Remember, Jew derives from Judah, one of the tribes of Israel, and one of Jacob's 12 sons. Mordecai descends from the tribe of Benjamin. Benjamin is Judah's youngest brother. Think about the tensions among the brothers we see throughout the Old Testament. I mean, the tribe of Benjamin in Judges 20 goes to war with the rest of Israel. The mothers of all those brothers, Rachel and Leah, hate each other. And think about Joseph and his brothers. In Genesis 37:4, it says this: "But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him." That's an echo of this last verse in Esther, when Mordecai speaks peace to all of his people. This is a family in search of peace. And here, finally, one brother speaks peace to the others. A son of Benjamin identifies with Judah as a Jew, bringing unity and peace to all of his people. But there's one more allusion between Benjamin and Judah that matters. And we've talked about this in a prior episode, but it's worth recalling. In Genesis 43:14, Jacob resigns himself to the possible loss of his youngest son, Benjamin, to Egypt. And he says, "If I am bereaved of my children, I am bereaved." A parallel to "if I perish, then I perish," by Esther. And what happens? Judah pledges to protect Benjamin. It's as if Judah says, I will give my life, put my life on the line for Benjamin, my brother. Well, what do we see in Esther? Mordecai, a Benjaminite, intercedes for the Jews. He puts his life on the line for the Jews. He is now the guardian, just as Judah was a guardian for his ancestor. And you see again this reconciliation between these brothers. The son of Benjamin saves the sons of Judah and brings about unity and restoration. Well, one day, generations later, a son of Judah will bring about the reconciliation of the world. The moral ambiguities of all the characters featured in Esther prompt our minds forward. What if there was a perfect righteous Jew who ascends the throne, not only of Persia, but the whole world? What if there was a wise king who reigned over all the nations, who wasn't given to lust, wasn't given to selfishness, but was self-giving and perfectly good? And what if that king, out of love for his people, endured great suffering to himself to bring about salvation? What if he said, if I perish, I perish? What if he resolved himself to suffer for the sake of his people, saying, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. If I perish, I perish. Let your will be done. Why does he do it? Because Christ, the Son of Judah, gives of himself for his people. And he brings salvation not just for Jews, but all Gentiles who come to him. And he rises above the throne of Persia and all the nations and all the kings to the right hand of God to reign over the nations. And it is this confidence in his reign that allows us, as a holy nation scattered among all the nations of the world, to occupy all of our diverse vocations and callings and stations in life with faith, integrity, and hope. Because in Christ, our sins have been annulled. The power of sin and death has been annulled, and our future is secure forever. That's what we commemorate, and that's what we celebrate, and that is our legacy.